What's up, everybody? Matt Gajeski here, back again with the Stochastic DFS channel. And today I am here to talk about college football DFS week 7. We're talking the main slate on Saturday. A lot of games to get into. So before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by Prize Picks. And if you've never heard of Prize Picks, they're a platform offering daily prop-based contests. You make lineups of player props, up to 5 of them where you can 10 extra entry fee. And you can do this across sports. We're talking college football today, so you can use some of this information, perhaps build some college football players, mix them with NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB. It's all going on right now. And if you click the link in the video description below, you're going to get 1 free month of Stochastic Plus Platinum, in addition to a match deposit bonus up to $100 when you click the link in the video description below. So make sure to check out Prize Picks. We're going to dive right in today, get to our player usage tool. A lot of games to get to. So up at the top, you see our metrics for the game environment, seconds per play. That's how fast teams are, pass rates, how offensive, defensive lines interact. That's just sacks allowed versus sacks generated, Vegas stats, defensive stats, where teams allow yards, and then where they allow them per attempt for context. And I guess let's just get right into this. Penn State, Michigan kicks things off here. 7-point spread in favor of Michigan. It's probably their first real test of the year, honestly. And they've taken a little money. 51.5 total here. Penn State, for DFS purposes, they're a hard team to target right now. Sean Clifford is kind of a glorified game manager. He's not running anymore like he used to. Like, he had a 400-yard rushing season back in 2019. Now he's wearing that big bulky knee brace. He can barely move out of the pocket. I don't know. He's tough to get to. 200 passing yards per game. One of the better defenses he's faced. Slow matchup overall. Penn State's 80th in pace. Michigan's 119th. He's just too expensive at 7,200. The backfield's a timeshare. They refuse to give Nick Singleton a full workload, so he's in a 50-50 split with Katron Allen at best. At worst, they involve Kevon Lee. Tough matchup. Just dumb play calling here. Singleton's really tough to get to outside of big tournaments, even though he's clearly the most efficient back by a wide margin. The only thing you're banking on if you play him is that they realize that, which I wouldn't make bets on. Receiving game, Keandre Lambert-Smith is questionable here. And if he doesn't play, you're probably going to see a lot more Harrison Wallace. Otherwise, we know where the 3 main targets are going to go. It's Tinsley, Parker Washington, and Keandre Lambert-Smith. None of them have been in voluminous roles this year. Tinsley averages 6.4 targets per game. Washington, he's at 5.6. And then tight end Brenton Strange has actually been pretty involved, but he's recently begun splitting time with Theo Johnson. I'm probably not playing anyone on Penn State, to be frank, but if I were, it's probably Parker Washington, and even he's a pretty bad price-adjusted play with some of the other values we have. On Michigan, they run the ball so much that it's kind of just Blake Corum or bust at this point. Penn State's a tough defense, allowing 5.8 yards per pass attempt, 3.0 yards per rush attempt. But Corum does have 3 straight games of at least 25 at carries, and then in addition to what he gives you in the pass game, which honestly isn't much because Donovan Edwards is back. He's the pass-catching back by preference here. You can look down at targets. He's had 6 targets in their last 3 games, and you don't even have a target. Well, you have 2 targets, I suppose, for Corum in that span. But clearly, Edwards is the pass-catching back. It's Corum or pass, honestly. McCarthy's not involved enough. Because of their heavy run rate and slow game plan, he's averaging just 192 pass yards per game. They're not using him as a rusher, which they did last year, which is problematic for his floor-ceiling combo. But if you want to play him in big tournaments, I think that's the only place it makes sense. In the pass game, Roman Wilson's banged up. Ronnie Bell actually looked to get banged up as well, but I think he's going to play. Occasionally, when Michigan's pushed, you're going to see these big target games for these guys. Ronnie Bell had 15 last week. Tight end Luke Schoonmaker. Don't know why I said Logan. Luke Schoonmaker, he was at 10. Cornelius Johnson's at 5. Typically, the target rotation goes number 1, Ronnie Bell. Number 2, Schoonmaker, the tight end. Number 3, Cornelius Johnson. Everyone after that is in a timeshare with Andrew Anthony and AJ Henning occasionally popping up here. It's a pretty tough situation to target right now, price adjusted. It would be tight end Schoonmaker or pass for me, to be honest. All right, let's move on to our next matchup here. Auburn taking on Ole Miss. This game has a 14.5-point spread. It is a 55.5 total, so pretty good game environment, and it actually might be sneaky. Auburn 46th in pace, 49.5% pass rate. Ole Miss third in pace, 37.5% pass rate, but we know they like to run the ball. They will pass a little more when needed. For Auburn, Robbie Ashford has taken over under center. He's had one good game against LSU, over 300 yards. The rest have been below 200. He's very mobile, though, 275 yards on the ground. He gives you a good floor. Ole Miss hasn't been tested a ton this year, so this could be a decent matchup for Ashford. The play volume is what I'm really considering here. All this to say, he's not the worst GPP on the board. He's also not the best. Probably a lower upside option. I'm not really too interested. In the running back room, Tank Bigsby's in a timeshare with Jarquez Hunter. Tank Bigsby briefly entered the transfer portal last year before Brian Harsin convinced him to stay. Boy, I bet he regrets that decision now. He's unusable in DFS. In the receiving room, John Samuel Shenker leads a very underwhelming group. Jarvarius Johnson is the most receiving yards on the team. Shenker has the most targets. They're actually tied in targets, so it's not a big gap here, but I can't really imagine playing an LSU receiver right now. The only one who even remotely draws my attention is Coy Moore, who's played a lot recently. Route rates of at least 73% in 3 straight games. And for Coy Moore, it comes down to price. He's 4K flat. Samuel Shenker, I guess you could play him. His routes are fairly consistent, 74%, 78% in the last 2 games. It's either Coy Moore or Shenker for me. Ole Miss. Jackson Dart actually comes out a little better projection-wise than you might expect. 6,700 for him. His price is falling. I assume that's because nobody plays him. He's just a little expensive previously, but if his price is going to keep falling and he has a 35-point implied team total, I'm going to take some shots probably, and mainly because of his rushing. 256 yards on the ground for Dart. That's good mobility for him. As a passer, he is fresh off a 400-yard game. Yes, that came against Vandy, but, it's potential ascendance here from Dart. And in this game, there's a chance that if it plays to the pace, Dart could be usable just based on raw volume. But more than likely, you're going to want to target the running backs. Zach Evans had been dealing with a hip pointer, so we saw Quinshon Judkins come out and play ahead of him in the last 2 games. But in the most recent contest, they each had 11 carries. So I think we're pretty close to that 50-50 split we saw earlier in the year. Evans does have the edge pass catching, which is the only difference between them. And I think that justifies the $100 difference. But to me, they are much closer to their efficient prices here with Judkins at 68, Evans at 69. That's probably where they should settle. These are 2 really efficient backs with the potential to handle 15 carries a piece in the right game environments. At receiver, we'll actually start with tight end. They lost Michael Trigg. That should elevate Casey Kelly into an every down role. Kelly actually played a good amount last year. He's the stone minimum at tight end. If you need a min option, Kelly's there. He's going to be behind the receivers, though. Malik Heath, Mingo, and Jordan Watkins. Jalen Robinson's returned from injury. Now, he could come back to his full role, but ultimately, he's been down around 20% of the routes even since returning, so I think this is problematic for him. It looks like they're set on Malik Heath, Mingo, and Jordan Watkins as their top 3. So I'm going to continue treating the receiver room like that. Heath would be the number 1 for me, price adjusted. He has the same amount of targets as Mingo, but, Mingo has more big playability. The yardage, 507 yards for Mingo, 346 for Heath. It's honestly pretty close. If you can find the 200 for Mingo, that's fine. But Heath, if you can't, they're both GPP options. And then if you can't find salary for either, I actually don't hate Jordan Watkins. He had 7 targets last week. He was previously in some sort of timeshare, but they've kind of released everybody else. JJ Henry's not playing as much. Jalen Robinson, we mentioned him. He's not playing a ton. He has 235 yards, and that 7-target game stands out to me. I like Watkins. If you just look at the routes last week, 91% for Watkins. The ancillary guys, Jalen Robinson, 12%. And then JJ Henry didn't even see the field. So I think it's pretty clearly these top 3. Kansas taking on Oklahoma. This game has a 9-point spread, 62.5 total. The total's coming down. The spread's moving towards Oklahoma. That's because Jalen Daniels was ruled out. So we have North Texas Jason Bean coming in. I saw the good game last week. It was impressive, but I still have questions with Jason Bean. In the history of his long tenured career with North Texas and then Kansas last year, he had a completion percentage in the 50s. He had a yards per attempt just north of 6, and he's in the same offense. Yeah, he came in and played well against TCU. I'll say that. but I have major skepticism on the talent of Jason Bean at 7,500. And it ultimately comes down to price because Bean is mobile. The Kansas offense has been solid and it's led Jalen Daniels to productivity. Bean had 7 design rush attempts. That's good. It should help his floor. But at 7,500, we just have a lot of other really good options. So I'll leave Bean for tournaments, and I'm probably only going to be using him in a few lineups. And largely because Oklahoma has been really, really bad on defense, where I think you can benefit with him. The backfield. Daniel Highshaw is out now for a little bit of time. Been curious to see how they use this backfield in the coming weeks. Well, they've basically committed to Devin Neal. 15 carries in their most recent game, 2 targets, 17 total touches. For reference, Kai Thomas came in, he handled 5 carries, and then Sevion Morrison came in and handled 1. More or less, they gave the lion's share of the workload to Devin Neal. He's 5,700. The only thing working against him is this team is now near 10-point underdogs. But I think you can use Neal. The matchup's solid. Oklahoma allowing nearly 5 yards per attempt to opposing backs. In the receiving game, Luke Grimm, Lawrence Arnold, and Quentin Skinner have somewhat solidified their roles. You're still going to see some rotation in terms of yards, targets, routes, whatever you name it. They don't lock these guys into every down roles. But just to tell you the routes, last week, 73% for Grimm. He had the 9 targets. That's solid. Arnold actually has the best role, 88% of routes and then 86% of routes. Skinner saw a big jump. He went up to 68% after playing just 47 the week before. So Skinner may be working into a large role. He's a good field stretcher for them. And then their tight end, Mason Fairchild, he's their main tight end. It's like a 70-30 split between him and Jared Casey. But those are the guys you want to target if you're playing this team in tournaments. I'm not going to get a ton of them, but I think they make solid GPP options because the upside we've seen numerous weeks now. But going to Oklahoma, they've got a big team total. Dillon Gabriel's back. The problem with Gabriel's his price. He's $9K, which is like last week. If you would have played Baron Morton, you would have gotten Baron Morton was half this price. So no, Baron Morton's not going to be available at the Stoneman this week, but there's a lot of cheaper options with similar volume to Gabriel. 126 yards on the ground is good for him, but 242 yards and a half yards on 27 attempts. He needs competitive games for this to be anything close to a ceiling. So Gabriel at this price is a pass for me, but there's always going to be upside in tournaments, especially with a good team total. The backfield's a disaster. Eric Gray's just been a stone bad player, and they've rightfully increased the role for Javonte Barnes, Marcus Major. One thing they did last week, which I'm curious to see if they continue, was they used Braden Willis and Jaleel Farouk on carries. 7 for Willis, 5 for Farouk. Farouk's a receiver. Willis is like a tight end. I guess they're using him a little bit as an H-back, but weird wrinkle here. Ultimately, Eric Gray's too expensive, and then there's just not enough work for Barnes and Major to target. Receiving room, they predictably did not throw with Beville under center. I don't even know why they played him. They have a good freshman in Evers, but apparently he's not ready. But Mims on the year, now that we have Gabriel back, he's fine. The volume's pretty bad for an AK receiver. 6.3 targets per game, 72.5 receiving yards. He's efficient, but he's going to need to get towards his ceiling, 10 targets, to pay off this AK salary. Jaleel Farouk averages 4 targets per game, 25 yards. Just not quite there yet. And then the last thing here, the team benched Theo Wease. He wasn't hurt. It was the coach's decision based on practice. They benched him for Drake Stoops. You can't play either of them right now because it's volatile, but, Stoops maybe you could play. And lastly, Willis, 3 targets, 7 carries last week. He actually is really involved with this team. He averages 3.7 targets per game. He's not the worst play at 4K flat. Iowa State takes on Texas. 17-point spread in favor of the Longhorns. 49.5 total, which is really bad. Iowa State's been one of the most disappointing teams in the country. They're 71st in play rate, but 58% pass rate. Hunter Deckers has been bad. There's no other way to put this. He has a minuscule ADOT. His average, his adjusted yards per attempt is lower than his yards per attempt. That means there's regression coming. He's not mobile. He's taken sacks. 15 sacks to 7 scrambles is a terrible rate. Basically, with Deckers, you need him to backdoor his way to a 300-yard game in order to pay off his salary at 5,100 even. But 253 yards per game on 38 attempts. It's horribly inefficient, and now he gets arguably his toughest matchup of the year against Texas. And I'm going to say it, Texas's defense is better than Iowa's. This is his toughest game. The backfield's now a timeshare between Terrell Brock, Silas, not Deion Sanders. It rolls off the tongue though, doesn't it? Terrell Brock, Deion Silas, that's the timeshare. You can't play either of them in this bad offense if they're going to be rotating. The only reason we played Brock is because he handled monstrous workloads to start the year before he got hurt. The only player who's viable, in my opinion, maybe there's a couple we could talk about. They're using just 3 receivers right now, and they're throwing so much that maybe you get some just raw PPR volume. But Xavier Hutchinson, he's averaging 14.7 targets per game, 101 yards. He's going to need like those 15 to 20 targets in order to pay off the salary. Otherwise, they're just throwing him the ball on screens. Like if he finishes with a 10-target game, he's going to have 60 yards, which is a problem. But they're probably going to throw it to him like 20 times because they're going to be down. Jalen Noel averages 6.2 targets per game. Same problems with him, low ADOT. Dimitri Stanley, 6.3 targets per game over the last 3 since he took on that elevated role. He's my favorite because he's 3.2K, and you're probably going to see 7 targets with Stanley. There's just no upside for anything more than like 45 scoreless yards and maybe a touchdown if you're extremely lucky. Texas, 33.25 implied team total. Quinn Ewers is 5,700. We still have a minuscule sample on Ewers. All of his stats are marred by that game he left early against Alabama, but his efficiency is really good. He showed off a little of the mobility he allegedly had coming out of high school. He was at -9 yards. It was just 1 sack he'd taken before then. And now we're seeing him, in the positives. I think that's where he'll be most of the time. And the volume should be there. Texas is a good offense. There's playmakers. Ewers at 5,700 is certainly live in tournaments. If he continues to play well, he's going to be more expensive than this later in the year. At running back, Bijan and Roschon handle the work. It is about a 70-30 split. Bijan is just so efficient, so involved. You can play him at 9,200 if you can find ways to get there, but just 2.7 targets per game, 21 touches per game. You're going to find cheaper backs that have similar workloads, but Bijan can always break a slate. This is the kind of game environment where they're huge favorites, where he absolutely could. I'll be playing some Bijan, just probably a little below the field. At receiver, they use 2 consistent receivers, 1 consistent tight end. It's Xavier Worthy, Jordan Whittington, and then tight end Jatavian Sanders. Sanders averages 5.2 targets per game. He's involved enough where he's the preferred play among these 3. For reference, 360 yards for Worthy, 354 for Whittington, 283 for Sanders. It's close enough where I'll just play Sanders, but you could mix and match any of these 3. Very clear target pecking order here. Minnesota, Illinois, not much to say on this matchup. 6.5 point spread in favor of Minnesota, 39 total. That's because Illinois is probably down their starting quarterback. Tanner Morgan he's not a 0 in the run game, but he's not giving you any difference-making ability. This team is so run-heavy and so slow that when they're leading in games, he's just not going to see enough volume. And when they're trailing, it means like enough negatives probably happened where do you really want to play Tanner Morgan anyway? Like even in that one game where they were trailing against Purdue, finishes just north of 250 yards. So Morgan, man, I don't know about this. 4,900, it's tantalizing, but really, what is the upside with Tanner Morgan here? I think he's a pass. The only guy you can really get to is Mo Ibrahim, who's back from injury. I'm really curious to see what the potential split looks like with Trey Potts, because they've used Potts a lot, and then he came back and split time with Bryce Williams in the game where Ibrahim missed. They obviously lost that game. So I think Ibrahim's going to come back and handle his normal workload. But on top of that, there's also concerns about matchup. Illinois is a phenomenal run defense. They're allowing 2.4 yards per carry. They know what Minnesota is going to do, so they're going to sell out to stop it. Concerns for me with Ibrahim at this price, but I tentatively side with him over Bijan. Don't feel great about it, but I'm going to be playing a little bit of each of these expensive backs, to be frank. In the receiving game, Brevin Spanford is still my favorite, leads the team in targets, second on the team in receiving yards, and he is 3,200. He had 6 targets last week. Michael Brown-Stevens had 6. Daniel Jackson had 10. Dylan Wright had 3. I'm just playing Spanford if I'm playing anybody here. Illinois. DeVito's hurt, which means we probably get Artur Sitkowski, who, how do I put this? He should not be playing for an FBS program. He has a sub 50% completion percentage. Like, we don't need to talk about him. He's the worst quarterback in football. He's terrible. For running back Chase Brown, he's going to see monstrous workload. For reference, like those of you considering Ibrahim, why don't you just play Chase Brown on the other side? Chase Brown averages 27.7 touches per game, 145 yards. He has more volume in the pass game, 54 yards this year for him, 2.3 targets per game. Like, isn't he everything you want Ibrahim to be at a cheaper price? The only hole you can point to is they're going to be underdogs here. It's a better matchup. Minnesota allows 3.9 yards per carry to Illinois' 2.4. Literally everything you like about Ibrahim is exactly what Chase Brown is. In the receiving game, Isaiah Williams is hurt. He has a concussion. We'll see if he passes protocol. He's actually trailing Pat Bryant in yards now. Pat Bryant, he has more yards than Isaiah Williams, despite seeing 21 fewer targets this year. Isaiah Williams is essentially just a turn around and catch the ball screen receiver, whereas Pat Bryant actually has like explosive playmaking ability. I would actually like this for Bryant more. If Isaiah Williams misses, he'll get more locked in targets, but I'm not targeting any Illinois receiver if Sitkowski plays. Miami taking on Virginia Tech, 47 total here, 7-point spread. Both of these teams are poor DFS targets right out the gate because of the low total. Josh Gaddis came in and broke Tyler Van Dyke after Rhett Lashley had a successful season with him. Van Dyke's not mobile, but he's seen his passing volume significantly drop. 261 yards per game on 35 attempts for him. I mean, he might get benched at this point because of Josh Gaddis's struggles. I think maybe Van Dyke is actually just bad and it was a small sample size trap, but I don't know. It's been a stark difference year over year with the changing OCs. They don't have good receivers either. Like, I'm out of this group, it's probably like Brashard Smith, who I'm trusting. There's not really a clear leader in terms of yards and routes. So if you look at the routes, Michael Redding last week, 70%. Brashard Smith, 90. Frank Ladson, 75. Keyshawn Smith went down to 33%. He's been terrible, so that makes sense. And then Will Mallory is splitting time with Jaleel Skinner. 67% of the routes for Mallory, 33% for Skinner. I don't think you can play anybody in this receiving room until Van Dyke shows a little more, until their offense gets it together. If I were playing anybody, it would be Brashard Smith, but don't feel great about it. And maybe it's honestly just the runners. They've been targeting the running back position a ton. Henry Parrish had 10 targets last week. He is playing clearly ahead of anybody else, and his role has been awesome. 19.6 touches, 75.6 rushing yards, 20.2 receiving yards, and now that he has a 10-target game under his belt, I'm pretty confident they're willing to target him in negative game script, which I don't even think he sees here, but the only hole you can point in Parrish is Virginia Tech plays good defense. Luckily, their weakness is against the run. 4.4 yards per attempt allowed. I'm going to play some Parrish at 4,800. Virginia Tech, Grant Wells has been atrocious. 113 rushing yards. That's his only redeeming quality. He's averaging 210 through the air per game. There's just better options. Receiving game for this team is terrible. It's probably Caleb Smith or Pass. He had 7 targets last week. Dwayne Lofton would be a close 2. But neither of these guys are particularly attractive. They also haven't committed really to anyone here. I thought that Jaden Blue would come in and play a lot. They won't commit to him. So last week, Dwayne Lofton, 88% of routes. That was by far the best on the team. Caleb Smith was second at 75%. Nobody else above 57. I'm just playing Lofton or Smith. In the backfield, we might get a bell cow in Malachi Thomas. His first came back from injury, 21 touches. That's something I like to see. Just immediately park Jalen Holston and Keyshawn King on the bench. Malachi Thomas is going to be their bell cow. They're just projected to score 20 points here. So I'd probably rather play Parrish on the other side. Bama, Tennessee. This is a really fun game. Just everything hinges on Bryce Young. 7-point spread, 65 total. Elite game environment. Okay, if Bryce Young plays, love this game. Bryce Young is exceedingly expensive. 154 yards on the ground. That's came on like one long run. Actually, before this year, he had negative career rushing yards. But there's always that CJ Stroud caliber upside. So Young, I think, needs to be in your player pool if he plays. If he doesn't, I think I'm probably going to avoid Jalen Milroe. Jalen Milroe is a glorified running back at 8,800. There's just a lot of opportunity costs with Milroe, even though Tennessee's secondary has been absolutely hemorrhaging points to decent competition. Anthony Richardson killed them. But I think it's mostly pass on the Alabama signal callers. Plus, like, if you stack Bryce Young, you know he's not really an elite dual threat. I do think his rushing production is fraudulent this year, and it's partially because his offensive line hasn't been great. In pass protection, that is. But then who do you stack him with? They do not have any clarity at wide receiver. This is the least clarity I can remember, I don't know, in 6 years since they had Jalen Waddle or something on the team. Maybe even Calvin Ridley. But let's talk about routes. Last week, the leader in routes was tight end Cameron Latou. And to be honest with you, I think Cameron Latou is the most consistent player we have on this team at 3,700. If I'm stacking, I'm starting with him, price adjusted. 86% of the routes last week. The next highest was Jahmyr Gibbs at 69%. He's second on the team in targets right now. I ran projections earlier this week, and because of how gnarly this has been, Jahmyr Gibbs came out as the highest projected leading receiver on the team. Behind Gibbs, number one among actual pass catchers, actual receivers, is Jermaine Burton, 65.5% route rate. On the year, he's at 70%. He's been horrendous. He's averaging 36 yards per game. He needs to be benched. Behind him, you have Ja'Cory Brooks, who is at 59%. Ja'Cory Brooks has actually been a little more efficient. He's tied for the team lead in yards despite playing, somewhat ascending snaps. But, behind Brooks, now we're getting into Trayshawn Holden, 52% of the routes. Kobe Prentice, 52% of the routes. In their most recent game, Isaiah Bond on 16%. Kendrick Law on 19%. They're just flat out rotating receivers, and they're all too expensive for it. Trayshawn Holden at 7,200. If you're telling me I'm getting 50% of the routes, Kobe Prentice at $6K for 50% of the routes, there is a chance they do not rotate. There's a chance okay, this is the week we decide on our guys, but they have not decided on their guys to start the year. There's no confidence in anyone's role except Latou. Anyway, let's go to Gibbs because his role is locked in. Injury scare last week, but they've really put their chips down on him because they can't get anything from the receivers. 25 touches last week, and his pass game role is sick. He's third on the team in yards, just barely. The leaders, Holden and Brooks, are tied at 223. Gibbs is at 220. They're using him everywhere. He's explosive in the run game. If they play to their potential, Gibbs is going to have a big day. I would rather play Gibbs right now than Bijan and Ibrahim because his pass game role is so key right now. Tennessee, this team is playing at the sixth highest pace. They're passing about 43% of the time. Hendon Hooker is playing at a Heisman caliber pace right now. Now, these are the games that he needs to win if he's going to take down the award. But 231 yards for Hooker. They've been in some non-competitive games too where they've taken their foot off the gas. 286.5 passing yards and 28 attempts. This guy's incredibly efficient. Now, Alabama is a semi-tough evaluation. They played a cupcake schedule. Quinn Ewers diced them up before he got hurt. And then they played A&M, who's kind of neutered. So is this defense really good? I certainly think it is, but I have enough questions where I'm not going to be shy about playing Hooker. I think other people are going to see the Alabama defense on the other side and shy away from this elite skill set Hooker has. There have been enough cracks in this supposedly impenetrable defense where I think Hooker can put up productive numbers here. He's also getting back Cedric Tillman, his wide receiver 1, who averages 82 yards per game on 9.3 targets when healthy. Wide receiver 2, Jalen Hyatt's there. Wide receiver 3, Brew McCoy. He's coming off a really big game and 7 targets in back-to-back weeks. I'm also going to be stacking Hooker, and I'm going to use some Hyatt in his first game back. I'm going to use him coming off the injury. In the backfield, I think you do run into a risky situation here. You see the game script does control what they do. They ebb and flow a little bit depending on whether they trail or whether they lead. 4 games ago, 9 carries for Wright, 10 for Jabari Small in a competitive spot. Last week, 22 for Jabari Small, 12 for Wright. So you can see in games with a positive game script, they're going to use these guys a lot. They're 7-point underdogs here. I like to take shots typically when they're favored, but I think I'm going to be focusing on the passing attack for this spot. Oklahoma State TCU. A reason I've been down on a lot of signal callers to start is because this game is electric. 69 total, 3.5 point spread in favor of TCU. Comes down to would I rather play Bryce Young when I can't stack him really at least comfortably? Would I rather play Dylan Gabriel at 9K? Or would I rather pay down for Spencer Sanders and Max Duggan that have better raw projections? These guys project for more points at a cheaper price than Dylan Gabriel in particular. Bryce Young he's really good, so can't knock him. It's just salary with Bryce. But Overall, Oklahoma State 5th in pace, passing 49% of the time. TCU 84th in pace, but don't be confused. They played a really easy schedule. They're playing really fast in competitive games. Their coach Dykes last year was top 20 in pace with his former team. 3.5 point spread again in favor of TCU, 69 total. Spencer Sanders, elite mobility, 241 yards so far on the ground, averaging 280 through the air on 34 attempts. We've seen enough cracks out of TCU where I'll play some Spencer Sanders. They had the game against Oklahoma where, Gabriel gets hurt, and their other competitive games, they've given up a lot of big plays. Jason Bean was carving up this team last week. Sanders, he can certainly do that through the air on his volume, no questions. Braden Johnson's dealing with a concussion, only injury to watch. He's their wide receiver 1 when healthy. Fortunately, they returned Jaden Bray to the fold last week. He immediately had 8 targets. But I think their pecking order with Johnson active is still going to be something like Braden Johnson 1, Bryson Green 2, Brennan Presley 3, Jaden Bray 4. I think the odd man out will be John Paul Richardson. But we don't know. There's 5 players. They've given a lot of playing opportunities. And last week, it's just unfortunate that Braden Johnson missed when Jaden Bray returned, so we couldn't see what they want to do here. But last week, the routes, Brennan Presley, 65%, Bryson Green, 91%, John Paul Richardson, 63%, and then Jaden Bray, 70%. That's why I think John Paul Richardson would be the odd man out. He was already at the lowest route rate of the group. But overall, price adjusted, love Bryson Green, love Braden Johnson, also interested in Jaden Bray. Backfield, Dominique Richardson, phenomenal workload, not splitting time with anybody. He just saw another 22 touches. The guy's now averaging 20.4 touches per game, 71.8 rushing yards, 26.8 receiving yards. In positive game scripts, he's a monster. You can play him at 7K. On the TCU side, Dugan is as good of, if not a better play than Spencer Sanders. Elite mobility with him, 204 yards. He's averaging 261 through the air on just 25 attempts. And remember, these numbers are depressed because the team made the mind-boggling decision to start Chandler Morris ahead of him in week 1 before he got hurt. Dugan is an excellent play. Another person that projects more than Dillon Gabriel with pretty easy numbers too. He finally just peppered Quentin Johnston with targets. Quentin Johnston, he has 38 targets on the year. He saw 17 of them in their last game. He's now very easily their target leader. They need to continue feeding him. He's an NFL receiver. Savion Williams is the wide receiver 2 in terms of routes run. While it's not reflected in targets, he's on the field the second most. I've taken a lot of shots on him and lost a lot of money this year, but I'll probably continue to throw some flyers. He's at 4,200, which is cheap, but at least 70% of the routes in 3 straight weeks. We cannot say that about Darius Davis or Tay Barber, who both fell down again last week. They just rotate a lot of these ancillary pieces. Jordan Hudson at 30%. Tight end, Jared Wiley at 40. Yeah, outside of that, it's not really pretty. The backfield is Kendre Miller's world. Amari DeMarcado, just 3 carries last week. Kendre Miller's taken on a full workload here. They're not using Amani Bailey. They're not using Trent Battle, Corey Wren. It is Kendre Miller. They're slight favorites, and Oklahoma State's defense is atrocious. It's worse on the back end. It's worse via the pass, but Kendre Miller, certainly capable of big games at 6,200. He's an excellent play. Love everyone in this game for the most part. NC State takes on Syracuse, 41 total, the worst on the board outside of the Illinois game. 3.5 point spread. Devin Leary got hurt. They're going to start Jack Chambers more than likely. He's a Charleston Southern transfer. We know nothing about him, but he's a senior. He's never played. Not optimistic, especially against Syracuse with this low total. I'll just pass. Demi Sumo Kongbai got injured in their last game too. He's allegedly going to return here. If he doesn't, Jordan Houston could play a massive role. That's going to come down to whether he plays or not because, again, Houston's not been the most efficient back this year. Sumo Kongbai has actually been better. In the receiving room, Devin Carter got hurt too. He's allegedly going to play. So that should make Thayer Thomas, Devin Carter, and Keon Lassane the top 3. Lassane actually has a really good route rate, so if I'm playing anyone, it's him. But probably nobody. Syracuse, the Devin Leary injury hasn't been good for Syracuse either. The totals plummeted in the game, so it kind of makes Garrett Schrader less attractive as well. Even though Schrader has really good mobility, 2 separate games north of 80 rushing yards. He's at 219 on the year. He's also averaging 246 as a passer on just 26 attempts. That's really efficient for Schrader. Just the game environment's terrible here. Sean Tucker's seen his price come down. I think partially because Schrader's been so involved on the ground, but He's still seeing a voluminous workload, 25 touches last week. The week before, he was at 27. I mean, it's a good buy low spot on Tucker. They're favored. Matchup's not scary. He's a great pass catcher. I'm going to play Tucker for sure. And then in the receiving game, tight end receiver hybrid, Orondick Gadsden leads the group here. He's the guy I'm targeting, the only guy I'm really playing with much confidence. Otherwise, the routes are pretty gnarly behind him. He leads the team in their last game, 95%. The next closest pass catcher was Devon Cooper. Cooper would be the number 2, but he's too expensive for his price. I'd probably just go down to Courtney Jackson or something at that point. Arkansas BYU, another really sneaky shootout. 66 total, 1.5 point spread. Arkansas is down 4 starters in their secondary. They moved guys, like some of their younger players, from offense to defense this weekend in practice. BYU was also down 3 starters on defense last week. We'll see what we get back from them, but both defenses are banged up, struggling. The total 66, and we have explosive offenses on both sides. KJ Jefferson projected to return. His price has fallen dramatically. He's now one of the better price-adjusted quarterbacks on the slate because he's highly mobile. So even though Arkansas passes the ball just 34% of the time, KJ Jefferson already accounts for 312 rushing yards, and he missed a game. He's a strong play here. What he gives you as a passer is a bonus. Raheem Sanders also in this monstrous workload. They started giving A.J. Green and Rashad Dubinian more work. Dominique Johnson's an afterthought, still nursing whatever injury he had. He's coming back slow. But Raheem Sanders, my goodness, last week, 25 touches, week before, 24. He's a monster right now. He's too cheap for being favored against BYU with this workload and this high run rate. The receiving game, Jaden Hazelwood is allegedly playing through, I believe, a shoulder separation, an AC joint sprain of some sort. Even if he was fully healthy, we don't have Treylon Burks walking through that door. And aside from not having a receiver of that talent, we just don't have a target share like that. So Hazelwood leads the team with 24.8%. As throwing as few times as they are per game, we really need like a locked-in target getter for us to play one of these guys. I've been playing a lot of Landers because he's been below 4K, but he's now 4.4. They're splitting Keatrone Jackson and Warren Thompson. Outside of that, Trey Knox splitting as well recently. Yeah, I was staying away from the pass catchers. BYU, Jaren Hall might be playing injured. That's kind of the rumor around Provo, but he's not going to say it. Their coaching staff certainly not going to say it. He's coming off one bad game against Notre Dame. Aside from that, he's been awesome. So I'll buy low on him. He's just not rushing as much this year. And he's a little more expensive than KJ, Max Duggan, and Spencer Sanders. I prefer those guys straight up, but if I'm ranking them, Jaren Hall's like probably 5th or 6th on this slate. And again, he's got the dream matchup of a lifetime here against whatever's left of Arkansas secondary. Plus receivers, interesting for him. It's a revolving door. They just lost Gunnar Romney again. Allegedly, he's questionable for the game, but he got carted off. So I would be surprised if he plays. Puka Nacua did return. He had 3 targets in their last game. I think his routes are probably going to rise. If Puka Nacua is playing anywhere near a full-time role, his price is way too cheap. 4.2K, this is like a 7K receiver. He had a 75% route rate last week. I'm interested in Nacua for sure. Romney got hurt after 50% of the routes, so we kind of got to see what they did without him. They used Keanu Hill on 70%, and then Cody Epps on 50, Braden Cosper at 25. Chase Roberts has also been out. If he plays, that would throw a wrench into things. But tentatively, let's assume Romney and Chase Roberts are out. I would rank this number 1, Puka Nacua, number 2, Keanu Hill, number 3, Cody Epps. And if Chase Roberts returns, I would put Roberts over Epps. Tight end is a split. Isaac Rex splitting with mainly fullback, hybrid back, Mason Wake, but not a full route share for Rex. The backfield, Miles Davis didn't play last week. We'll see if he comes back. If he does, it's a 3-way committee. If he doesn't, it's a 2-way committee between Brooks and Lopini Katoa. Katoa functioning as the passing down back. I have a lot more interest in the pass game than the run game here. Couple games left. Maryland, Indiana, a sneaky game, 61.5 total, 11.5 point spread in favor of Maryland. We've been talking a lot about how they've run a little bit more, played a little slower. 77th in pace, 55% pass rate. So while they are down in both metrics, they're still pretty good offense to target. Taulia Tagovailoa, seen his numbers fall slightly, 288 through the air, just 88 yards on the ground. His bottom line's been a little worse, but he's still stackable here. The problem is Maryland doesn't really commit to any pass catchers with any consistency. We've been talking about this a lot. The only player with consistent routes is Raheem Jarrett, and he just saw his routes drop from 84% to 68%. Going down the list, Jay Sean Jones last week, 44%. Corey Dykes at tight end, 56. Dante Demas, 41. Jacob Copeland, 49. CJ Dippre, 41. Ty Felton, 49. I mean, I don't know who to stack here. Throw your darts. There's about 8 guys that are going to play 50% of the routes. It's made it really hard to stack Tagovailoa this year. You can honestly probably use them naked. The backfield, they've ebbed and flowed. One week, Roman Hemby leads. The next week, Antoine Littleton leads. The following week, it's a direct timeshare between the two. I have a preference towards Roman Hemby for his role in the pass game. He has at least 4 targets in 4 straight games. He averages 3.5 targets per game and 34 receiving yards. Littleton's a big bruiser, so he does not play that role. But we're talking about backs in very specific roles in a timeshare. Hemby narrowly gets the edge, but there's better plays overall. I'd rather save the 1K and play Parrish. If you were ever going to target an Indiana player, this would be the spot. Their team total is 25. They're not underdogs by that much. So Connor Bazelak, negative 131 yards. That is so hard to overcome. He needs 300 yards through the air. The only redeeming quality is that if he was ever going to get it, this is the spot. But, man, that is absolutely brutal for Bazelak. He's terrible. Behind him, I guess I should say throwing, who he throws the ball to, it's number 1, Cam Camper. Number 2, DJ Matthews, who's hurt. We'll see if he returns. Number 3, Emery Simmons. Emery Simmons has seen his price rise dramatically over the last couple weeks. He's now 300 behind Camper. I'll just play Cam Camper at that price instead of him. Backfield's a split between Shivers and Henderson. Not much to see there. My favorite game of the slate, the sneakiest game on the board, Ohio Western Michigan. Sneaky DraftKings throwing on a MAC game. Melts my heart. 58.5 total. Pick'em game. Love that. Ohio heads to Kalamazoo to face Western Michigan. Let's go. Starting with Ohio, Curtis Rourke has unlocked a new level this year. Never seen this from him. Thought he was a bottom 3 signal caller in the MAC, but now he's averaging 324 yards per game, 97 yards on the ground cumulatively. I got to take my L. Curtis Rourke has been a stud, and now he gets a really good matchup here. Western Michigan is allowing 9.4 yards per pass attempt, 4.8 yards per rushing attempt. It's a dream matchup for Rourke. He's involved everywhere. You can play him with confidence. You can also stack him, and it's pretty easy to do so. Sam Wilglutz, excuse me, Sam, I don't know how to say your name, but Sam Wilglutz, he's my favorite play. He's 5K flat. He averages 7 targets per game, 73.8 receiving yards. He's completely fine, and he has the most routes on the team. If you break it down behind him, it's a little confusing, but luckily we're going to do it for you guys. Behind him, the second most active receiver is James Bostic. His route rate was at 83% last week, which was higher than any other pass catcher. He's averaging 51.2 yards per game. So I think he's seeing the uptick because he's been so efficient. But I would rather play Will Glutz than Bostic. He's cheaper. And then the 3 would be Miles Cross for me, who's averaging 5.3 targets per game, 38 yards. Cross saw his route rate drop from 93% to 66, but on the year, he still has a good route rate. He's ahead of Jacoby Jones. If I'm ranking these players, it's 1, Will Glutz, 2, Bostic, 3, Cross, 4, Jones, and everyone after that is just rotational players, rotational fodder. In the backfield, Say Bangura missed a game, and since he's returned, walked right back into a massive workload, 24 and 17 touches for Bangura. I think he's completely fine at this price. Nolan McCormick did play admirably in his place, and he has now earned change of pace opportunities, which, if anything, just hurts Bangura. But Bangura is the one. I think McCormick could be used in GPPs too. Western Michigan also draws a really good matchup here. Ohio allows 8.4 yards per pass attempt, 5.1 yards per rush attempt. Jack Salopek, I think he's kind of a cut below the guys we've been talking about in the last couple games. Only averages 199 pass yards per game on 32 attempts, so just not efficient. 89 rush yards leaves a little to be desired, but if you're playing anyone on this team, I'm probably just looking to the pass catchers or one of the backs. We'll start with the pass catchers here because I think there is something to at least mention with raw PPR volume and a good matchup. The route leader here is Corey Crooms, no surprise. Number 2 is Anthony Sambucci, 98% of the routes last week, 96 the week before. Sambucci had 8 targets in their last game. I think a lot of people would gravitate to Galloway, who's really involved himself. Galloway, 77% of the routes, 80% of the routes, but Sambucci's quietly been ahead of him in terms of routes. And then Blake Bosma, very clear tight end option. He's would be a 4th in my opinion, but I think any of these guys are fine. Sambucci's really cheap. I'm going to play some of him for sure. In the backfield, it's like a 65-35 split between Sean Tyler and Ladarius Jefferson. Tyler is more involved in the pass game by a hair. He's also more efficient everywhere. So I'm trying to find the salary for Tyler if I'm playing either of the backs, and I'll be mixing them in. Final game here, Wisconsin, Michigan State. Wisconsin, they're laying 7.5 on the road here against the Spartans, 50 total. Tells you a lot about Michigan State. Wisconsin had a scoring outburst last week in Graham Mertz's career best game, 299 yards, 5 touchdowns. I wouldn't expect that every week. I think it says a little more about Northwestern than it does Mertz. He's atrocious in his career, so I'll fall back on that large sample size. Not a mobile quarterback, not the most efficient. Shamir Dike, excellent game here, but now all these guys are seeing their prices rise. I'm not interested in any Wisconsin pass catchers at their prices, but I am interested in Braylon Allen from a contrarian perspective. Chez Mellusi got hurt. So my question is, do they use Isaac Guerendo or Julius Davis in the same role they use Mellusi, or are we going to get the full Braylon Allen treatment we've been trying to get all year? I hope his touch volume goes up to like 30, which we've been hoping for but haven't seen. I have a lot of optimism with Braylon. He had 24 touches last week. I'm going to play some of him in the expensive tier as well, especially going against Michigan State, who is quietly a really weak defense. Michigan State, Peyton Thorne is taking a step back. Not all his fault, but not mobile, 206 passing yards per game. Just there's better price adjusted options. They've moved to a 3-way timeshare because of their struggles in the run game. So it's no longer just Berger, but Broussard and Collins are both involved. Tough to play. The receiving game, Keon Coleman, just 1 target last week, disappointing. But Jayden Reed, he's firmly reasserted himself as the wide receiver 1. I actually asked the question at one point whether he was the wide receiver 1 or not, or if Keon Coleman is taken over. From a route perspective, yeah, it's still very clearly Jayden Reed. Keon Coleman took a step back. Trey Mosley took a step back. They're evaluating guys now. They're getting Jeremy Bernard on the field, Monterey Foster, even Cade McDonald. Michigan's phoning it in. Michigan State, that is. If I'm playing anyone, it's relatively cheap Jayden Reed. I think he makes the most sense, and everyone else is unplayable here. But that's the main slate. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know in the comment section what you think about everyone we talked about. If I missed somebody, if there's a play you really like, play I glossed over, whatever it may be, I'll make sure to get back to you. And if you'd like, I'm on Twitter at @Matt_Gajewski. You can always reach out to me there as well. But thank you to Prize Picks for sponsoring the video. Otherwise, we'll be back again next week, and we'll be back with Live Before Lock later in the week, talking through all these plays, answering your questions ahead of the slate. Until next time, good luck, everybody. We'll see you then.